Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX World and I am Megha Sharma. Let's take a look at the big headlines of the hour. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned that any Western troops deployed to Ukraine would be considered legitimate targets by Moscow. Putin's warning comes after French President Emmanuel Macron said that 26 countries had pledged to provide post-war security guarantees to Ukraine. Veteran Thai politician Anutin Charnvirakul has now won Parliament's vote to become country's next Prime Minister. Anutin won 311 votes, securing a comfortable majority of the 492 MPs in the National Assembly. This is the third Prime Minister that has been elected by the Parliament in the last 2 years. Portuguese police have confirmed that 11 of the 16 people killed in the Lisbon funicular cable crash were foreign nationals. Amongst those who died in the crash include 5 Portuguese, 2 South Koreans, 3 British, 1 Swiss, 1 American, 2 Canadian, and 1 Ukrainian and 1 French national. Kremlin says it will not accept any foreign troops in Ukraine after French President Emmanuel Macron announces 26 allies have pledged forces by land, sea or air once the ceasefire is reached. Macron said US support will be finalized soon, with President Trump signaling possible air cover as Zelensky presses for sky protection. China has strongly opposed any move to impose economic pressure after President Trump urges Europe to target Beijing over the war in Ukraine. Foreign Ministry spokesperson of China has warned against dragging China into the matter. The Israeli military says it now holds 40% of Gaza city and vows to intensify operations until Hamas is defeated, while slamming an EU commissioner for calling the war a genocide. At the same time, US Secretary of State warns countries that recognize a Palestinian state will only create more problems. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the United States will blow up foreign crime groups if necessary, as he announces Ecuador's Los Lobos and Los Choneros will be labeled terrorist organizations. His warning comes days after a US strike killed 11 people on a Venezuelan vessel in the Caribbean, while 2 Venezuelan aircraft later fly close to a US Navy ship. Australia and Japan agreed to deepen security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, including joint evacuation of citizens at risk overseas. Japan's Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya says both countries will strengthen deterrence and plan for regional contingencies. Big news of the hour: the US President Donald Trump has now once again taken a shot at the Asian leaders. Taking to Truth Social, Trump said that America has lost India, Russia to the deepest, darkest China. The post followed a picture of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, China's President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin together in the same frame. Andrew Latham is joining me on the telecast. Andrew, it looks like the war between America and the allies that have met at the SCO Summit has only become more serious, more lethal, where President Trump has now released a statement on Truth Social saying that India and Russia have been lost by America to the deep, dark Chinese territory. How do you react to this?
Well, there's really only one way to react. President Trump gets it wrong. India is not lost, and it certainly hasn't fallen unambiguously and decisively into the Chinese camp. That's not in India's national interest. I note that Prime Minister Modi did not show up for the big parade in Beijing, even though he was at the SCO Summit and there was lots of hugs and kisses and backslapping. That is India's grand strategy, multi-alignment, sometimes aligning with China on certain issues, sometimes with the US, often given the history with Russia. And the United States, President Trump, his administration need to get it into their head that India will never be unambiguously on Team America. It's always going to hedge its bets. It's always going to play the multi-alignment game. And the sooner the U.S., this administration, wraps its head around that, the better off everybody will be.
All right. Now, talking about economic sanctions that have been proposed by US President Donald Trump during that video conference that was being held at the Paris summit with the European leaders, Ukraine included, there was a mention, a proposal that Europe should sanction China for supporting the war in Ukraine. Do you feel that the tepid response that the Trump administration had with regards to dealing with China, particularly when it came to the tariff wars and trade deals, there's an additional 90-day reprieve, which is an exception that has been provided to China. Looks like the claws are out, and finally, Trump is taking China head on.
Well, I think in Trump's mind, he does see this as Cold War 2.0. And he kind of understands that the unipolar moment when the United States was the sole superpower and all that, that's past. And we're in this multipolar era, but he still tries to impose this Cold War framework on it. And he sees the U.S. as locked in this existential struggle with China for world hegemony or leadership or dominance, whatever you want to call it. And this is simply to overstate the fact. I don't think that accurately represents China's aspirations on the world stage. And I think there are some real downsides to adopting that posture on the part of the United States. Once you say Cold War, all of a sudden you're into containment. And once you say containment, you're into mobilizing great powers and middle powers and lesser powers in a gigantic alliance or coalition is a better technical term, against China. And the Europeans are falling into the trap, as it were. They're motivated more by the war in Ukraine and putting pressure on China there, but it all adds up to the same thing. A grand coalition of states, great powers and middle powers, arrayed and aligned against China, which is only going to impel China to do things which it might not otherwise do, because it can play the Cold War game as well. And I remind your viewers that the Cold War was a Cold War, but it almost became hot in 1962 over Cuba, 1984 over a NATO exercise, Able Archer, and the Berlin crisis as well earlier than that. It was a very near-run thing, and we don't want to run that risk again.
Right, absolutely. What do you anticipate is going to happen, particularly with regards to China-US trade wars? There was already an intention that had been expressed by the Trump administration in the past few months of levying tariffs to the tune of 240% on Chinese goods. And there was a reciprocal response that came from China as well. It looked like China was amongst the very few nations that stood up against the Trump tariffs, after which Trump had to de-escalate. He had to tone down his tariff war narrative against China. What's going to happen now?
I don't think the United States can afford a full-blown tariff war with China. It can't really afford one with India either. And I think the United States and the Trump administration might be learning that. I mean, the tone has shifted with respect to India in recent days. Not yet the policy, but the tone. Far less harsh on the part of the Trump administration and President Trump in particular. Look, the difference between where we are today and the Cold War with the Soviet Union is the only thing Americans bought from the Soviet Union was the occasional bottle of vodka. Beyond that, there was no economic interdependence. There was no economic interconnection. And that's not the case with China. These two economies are thoroughly integrated. And the costs to Donald Trump's electoral base, the MAGA crowd, would be enormous. I note, by the way, that if you read the fine print of the tariffs on India, pharmaceuticals and electronics are exempt from the 50% tariffs. Why? Because the MAGA constituency would face huge price increases in terms of their medications and in terms of their iPhones and things of that nature. And the same is going to be true of China as well. There'll be a lot of histrionics and a lot of theatrics about 250,000 million% tariffs. And then when it really matters, when it's in America's best interest, those tariffs won't be applied to particular sectors. So is it going to be an era of turbulence? Yes. Are the tectonic plates shifting in ways that will result in Cold War 2.0? I think not.
It's also interesting because while Trump has imposed these additional punitive 25% tariffs on India for purchasing oil from Russia and quote-unquote fueling the war in Ukraine, the European Union is very eager to sign that long-pending free trade agreement with India. There are indications yesterday Ursula von der Leyen and the EU Council President, both of them had a joint phone call with Prime Minister of India, and both were discussing how there is a need for increased push for signing that FTA by the end of 2025. We also see there is an announcement that has been made by the Chinese Foreign Ministry that the Portuguese Prime Minister is going to be visiting China very, very soon. So while Europe continues to move forward in having cordial trade relations, bilateral relations with India and China, notwithstanding the Ukraine war and the purchase of oil from both these countries from Russia, it looks like United States of America under Donald Trump has dug itself inside a hole. What do you think are going to be the implications of this?
Well, my first observation is that if one is looking for consistency in terms of foreign policy, especially European foreign policy, you're, to use an Americanism, barking up the wrong tree. Europe has, you would think that given Chancellor Merz's recent pronouncement that we really have to get tough with Russia over Ukraine, well, maybe stop buying Russian oil and gas, Europe. That might help. And then maybe if you're really going to be consistent, don't do a free trade deal with India that is purchasing Russian oil. I don't want to overstate the importance of that, but it's happening. If you would think that if there were a consistent European policy on this, A, they'd stop buying Russian oil, and B, they wouldn't enter into free trade agreements with countries that are purchasing Russian oil. And that's not the case. Europe is conflicted. On the one hand, it's making a great deal about the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, it has economic interests. It wants good trade relations with 1.4 billion Indians, obviously, with a very sophisticated high-tech sector that Europeans can benefit from. It wants good trade relations with China, obviously, 1.2 billion people, also sophisticated in certain subsectors of the economy. And it wants good trade relations with the United States. In a slightly different universe in which one's interests lined up with one's policies, this wouldn't be the case. But the Europeans are actively courting all three markets. And I'd be very surprised if they didn't do a deal with India, finalize that deal pretty soon.
Right. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me, sharing your views. It's also interesting because Donald Trump has remained quiet with regards to the European Union pushing for free trade agreement with India. Is he then going to decouple from European Union for dealing with the two countries, China and India, that have strong relations, bilateral and trade with Russia? Moving on, let's take a look at the other big development that has taken place. Veterans High politician Anutin Charnvirakul has won the parliament's vote to become the country's next prime minister. Anutin has won 311 votes, securing a comfortable majority of the 492 MPs in the National Assembly's lower house. The official final results have now been revealed. His appointment will be formalized after receiving approval from King Maha Vajiralongkorn, with his government expected to take office in a few days. Meanwhile, Thailand's Pheu Thai party has responded to the vote. It has said that it is ready to be in the opposition and will return to power to deliver on its policies. Anutin succeeds Pathongtarn Shinawatra, who was recently dismissed by the court order after ethics violations related to a politically sensitive phone call with Cambodia's Senate President Hun Sen. Anutin had served in Shinawatra's cabinet but resigned and withdrew his party from her coalition after the leaked call sparked public outrage. Munchai Wongkiti Krewan is on the telecast with me. Thank you very much for joining me. And my first question to you about, 3 prime ministers being elected in a span of 2 years. If you could shed more light into this political turmoil that Thailand has been going through in the recent past.
You're right. We are now, as a Thai journalist, we are now in political turmoil, of course, and we have new prime minister's name already, Anutin Chandragul. He just got the vote, 247 votes, after intense debate with his supporters pushing for a swift vote by facing strong objections from the opposition. The decision right now awaits royal endorsement before he can formally assume office. Anutin is expected to steer the country through a period of political uncertainty while regaining his influential post as interim ministry to oversee key administrative affairs. But the big problem is his government. His government is a small majority government. Out of 492 lawmakers, Anutin received support from 289 MPs, but with 203 votes cast for the opposition Pheu Thai party and other parties. So his mandate is seen as a fragile. If you ask me about the situation of Thailand's political situation, is really fragile right now because the new parliament, the new prime minister, I would say, would dissolve the House within the 4 months. This is a deadline. Dissolve the parliament within the 4 months and call for a fresh general election. It's been early next year.
Right, absolutely. If you could tell us what happened, because Anutin, who is now set to become the Prime Minister of Thailand, was part of the cabinet of the previous Prime Minister. She was removed from office by court because of that leaked phone call between her and the Cambodian head of state. This was with regards to the very sensitive border dispute that Thailand and Cambodia have been fighting over the past several years. It became tense in the last few weeks and months. What led to him withdrawing from the cabinet and that caused the government to fall down?
All right, that's really complicated. It's all about the direction of administration of the previous government, Pathongthang Chinawat. But many news sources say that it's all about the cabinet reshuffle and, of course, the budgets of the fiscal year. I would say only that's the problem. And now he's just back on his track right now. But let's see what he could do with his 4 months available, because right now the Thai economy is kind of weak. The consumption, domestic consumption is weak, and tourism, we see less tourists than we expected. So the economic concern is the crucial point for Anutin's cabinet, and of course the social issues, and of course the dispute between Cambodia and Thailand. We know that the army insists that we will protect our land and our sovereignty.
Right, and also, the former prime minister, the father of the recently indicted prime minister, has also fled to Dubai. Now, that is a political party that he has had for the last several decades. The dominant political party of Thailand up until now. What's the scenario over there? And of course, the opposition says that they are going to sit in the opposition and are going to return. And they are very hopeful that they come back to power and implement their policies for the good of Thailand, is what the opposition party has officially made a statement.
Yeah, Pheu Thai would be at the opposite side for sure. But the Thaksin Shinawatra, Dr. Thaksin Shinawatra, you know that yesterday, millions of Thai people were watching the route of his flight. He initially went to Singapore for medical checkup. He said that, and just then he changed the route to Dubai, and he's now in Dubai right now. But he confirmed that he would be back in Thailand in this September the 9th for to go to the court, and we are now waiting for his coming back. But for pure Thai party, I think they would do anything they could do to get back all the votes from the general election. So this upcoming 4 months would be intense and serious, I would say.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining me and sharing that update coming in from Thailand, a new prime minister that has been elected with a majority in the parliament. All right, shifting our focus to the Ukraine-Russia war. The Russia Defense Ministry has now announced that the Russian forces have taken control of Markov in eastern Ukraine, intensifying the ongoing conflict. Meanwhile, discussions continue among Ukrainian allies about a potential peace plan involving a large demilitarized buffer zone inside Ukraine to separate Russia and Ukrainian territories. According to reports, the United States could lead monitoring efforts of this zone using advanced technology like drones and satellites, coordinating with other countries. Troops securing the buffer are expected to come from non-NATO nations such as Saudi Arabia or Bangladesh, avoiding NATO involvement to address Russian concerns. Key details include rules of engagement and responses to violations remain under negotiation. The plan requires approval from Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and allied leaders including American President Donald Trump. Professor Vasilin Popovsky, who's a professor and vice dean, Jindal Global Law School, is joining me on the telecast. Thank you very much. And what do you make of the security guarantees that the 26 European nations have pledged? It's also interesting, with the exception of the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni yesterday saying that it will not be providing Italian troops to give the security guarantees, will not be deployed along the Ukrainian border in event of a peace deal that is signed between Ukraine and Russia.
Well, not every country needs to supply troops. Why Italians? There are plenty of other countries. There are 26 countries that pledge troops. Italians are not known for very good soldiering, by the way. They lost almost every war in the history. But apart from the joke, yes, there is plenty of other volunteers, British, French, Polish, and so on. But the important question is, when will that happen? When the ceasefire will happen? Not who will provide the troops. Obviously, United Nations should provide the troops, and countries should volunteer to the United, like in every other conflict where there has been any ceasefire between the two Koreas, in Cyprus, in the Middle East, in Lebanon, between India and Pakistan. It should have the United Nations legitimacy, the blue helmets. And within that United Nations, any other country apart from those 26 can also volunteer. So I really don't understand this kind of a constant debate between who should be those who will be stationed in Ukraine. The more important question really is, when will the ceasefire happen? And what I'm a little bit disappointed, by the way, by the Europeans here, they are not talking about further sanctions. They are not talking about even military support for Ukraine. What the Ukrainians need is military support as to push Russia on the negotiation table. They are talking what will happen in ambiguous future, when one day, maybe, probably, there will be some ceasefire to monitor. Mm-hmm. So for me, all this discussion is kind of a very little relevant at this stage before we get to the ceasefire. Once we have the ceasefire, then it's easy to allocate some, as I say, United Nations troops, ideally.
Right. I do would like to seek a comment from you regarding US President Donald Trump's recent post saying that Russia and India have fallen into the hands of the quote-unquote deep, dark China. Do you think this is going to impact the relationship between US President Donald Trump and Russian head of state Vladimir Putin, especially since the Alaska summit that had some positive outcomes?
Something very expected, by the way, that here there are no friends and foes. Basically, there will be meetings, and in the future it may happen again. Obviously, Donald Trump should be very naive to think that a meeting in Alaska has any follow-up here. He's absolutely wrong to think that Vladimir Putin has any good feeling about him. These are usual playing games. They meet, they shake hands, they smile, they make photos. They are happy to be seen on the first page of the newspapers, and nothing follows after that. By the way, neither from Alaska meeting, not from the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, anything came out of that meeting. It's photo opportunity. Leaders meet, they shake hands. There was a parade about the 80th anniversary. I don't think any significant development whatsoever. On your specific question, I don't think that Donald Trump knows what's going on. He changes his mind. He speaks one thing one day, next day he speaks another thing. So even commenting on what Donald Trump said yesterday for me is irrelevant because he doesn't know what he said yesterday. How can we understand what he means if he doesn't know what he means? But yes, obviously Putin and Xi Jinping and Modi, they met, but that doesn't mean anything. Again, there is no alliance between those three countries. They are meeting, they are shaking hands, but there is no, for example, military cooperation. It's not a military alliance. These are countries with specifically big economies.
Right.
So often we see some of their economies or their economic power given as a kind of criteria, but other than that, other than the sums of their economies, there is nothing else.
Right, absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing your views on this subject. Moving on, let's take a look at the other big development that we are tracking for you. The United States of America is considering imposing new restrictions on Iranian delegation ahead of the United Nations General Assembly, which begins on 22nd of September. These measures could limit the ability of the Iranian diplomats to travel freely in New York, including potential restrictions on the shopping at large wholesale stores. This move comes after the Trump administration had imposed sanctions on the Palestinian Liberation Organization president to travel to New York to participate in the UNGA 2025 later this month. There were protests that had been raised by the Palestinian president with regards to this crackdown by the Trump administration. Joining me on the telecast is Gedalia Bloom. He's a Middle East affairs expert. He's joining me from Israel. Let's hear it from you. What is your perspective on this imposition of sanctions, not visa restrictions, not allowing? Initially, it was the Palestinian president on whom sanctions have been imposed. And now we understand that there are fresh sanctions, fresh restrictions that have been imposed on Iranian delegates to participate in the UNGA that happens later this month.
Well, so the benefit of the United States having the UN on its own soil is that they get to pick and choose who comes in and who doesn't. And while they're being very open and allowing enemy states like Iran to enter into the United States on visas, certainly that doesn't come with a blank check to be able to go around the streets of New York City and go shopping, as you mentioned before. And so I think that's in every right of the Trump administration, the federal government, to be able to determine who is able to walk freely in the streets and who is not. And I think any restriction should have common sense behind it. And I think that they do. You're dealing with the Iranian regime, who is essentially responsible for funding many arms of terror throughout the Middle East. One of them being Mahmoud Abbas, who is also being sanctioned, who spends, I believe, up to $400 million a year from his budget, a lot of it coming from the international community, to what they call pay for slay, where you have terrorists in Israeli prisons who are getting paid every single month a monthly stipend for killing Jews. This rewards them. It also creates more incentives for others who haven't yet killed a Jew to be able to make a lot more money than they would be sitting in jail than they would be if they got a job.
Right, absolutely. What do you also make of, the Israeli Defense Forces have now released a statement that they are in control of 40% of Gaza. There has been a continuous effort by the military forces led by Prime Minister Netanyahu to uproot Palestinians and shift them to other countries, other regions. It has witnessed a backlash from countries across the globe, leaders from across the globe, whether it's France, Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. How do you think this is going to pan out, and what is the end goal of the Netanyahu government, if at all the Palestinians are removed from the Gaza Strip?
Well, number one, I don't necessarily agree with your terminology being the civilians being uprooted from Gaza City. In fact, the evacuation orders had been set, and they're being sent again today. In fact, and Hamas's reaction to these evacuation orders is by setting up roadblocks, not allowing their civilians to leave, telling their own people that they should not leave. So while the world is condemning Israel for setting up humanitarian zones or at least opportunities for civilians to leave a battlefield, Hamas is keeping them in. Unfortunately, the international community is in line, in cahoots with Hamas in wanting to see civilians being used as human shields. And while Israel is trying to get them out of harm's way, we're being accused of ethnic cleansing, while Hamas is essentially the international community does not condemn Hamas. They don't scrutinize them, and they don't even ask basic questions. Why are they telling people not to leave, and why are they beating their own people in the streets if they are to leave? And there's been reports on the ground that families are actually jumping out or exiting out of their apartment windows down alleyways in order to avoid these roadblocks from Hamas.
Right. All right. Thank you very much for sharing your views on the matter. All right. On that note, I slip into a short break. Stay tuned on NewsX World for more news and updates on the other side.